We live in a corrupt world full of bad people who do awful things and are never caught and punished for what they do. So if you heard that a killer was making some of these people pay for all their crimes, how would you feel? Would you want the police to go out and catch them? Would you want this person to be stopped? And just how hard would you be rooting for the police in that case? That's what's going on in our book for this episode, Death Notice. But maybe the more interesting philosophical question would be, does this book have some moral or philosophical depth? Is it pure entertainment? And also, just how much can or should you adapt a work in translation for a different market, different readers? That's interesting too. And with me to talk about that is my guest for this episode, Haluza. He's a very interesting guy. We had a very interesting chat. Before we get to that, let's have the TrChFic news. So, you might have noticed this is a little bit different from the initial upload of the episode. That's because I did a goof. I had the TrChFic news playing right on top of this intro, and it sounded horrifying. So this is a second upload that fixes that problem, by the way, disclaimer. Yeah, so our first entry in the TrChFic news, it's a new podcast that's come out. It's called the Southern Tour Podcast. It's by a very cool guy, Jonathan Chatwin. And it's all about the tour of southern China that Deng Xiaoping did in the early 90s to try and keep the reform and opening period of China going, stop the economy from flipping back to this style it was in under Mao Zedong. So, you know, whether you find that interesting or not is probably down to you and what you like. But I think, I haven't listened to it yet, but I think it sounds really cool, so I'll be checking that out. Okay, second item on the TrChFic news is a novel that is now up for pre-order. It's Strange Beasts of China by Yang Ge, translated by Jeremy Tiang, and published by Tilted Axis. Now, the plot, it goes something like this. A young cryptozoologist is sent to investigate the lives of beast-like people who live among us, and along the way she learns a thing or two about her inner beast, so to speak. So, knowing Yang Ge, this should be literary and amusing and interesting. And yeah, can't wait to read it, to be honest. Third TrChFic news item, and I'm just trying to power through these because I'm not enjoying redoing them all, is a really interesting academic book that is now up for pre-order. It's called China's, Muslims, and Japan's Empire. And last time I read the whole blurb, I'll try and summarize it this time. It's a study of an often overlooked or previously not studied aspect of the Japanese kind of imperial or colonial, whatever you want to call it, rule of the parts of China that they conquered before they lost them again at the end of World War II. And it's looking at what Japan was doing in northern and northwestern China to try and win over the Muslim population of China, and looking at things like, I think it says something like offering an alternative market, so trying to win the Chinese Muslims over in some economic fashion, but also isolate them from the Soviet Union. So a lot of stuff going on in that book, and the cover is really nice too, by the way. So looks fascinating. Would be quite keen to read that too. That's the TrChFic news. Now let's proceed with the interview. Hope you enjoy it. On the show, I've got Haluza. Hi, Zach. How's it going, and what have you been up to?
Hi, Angus. I'm doing fine. I guess as fine as I can be here in New York. I guess maybe the most recent news on my end. I recently got a new job at Warner Music as a software engineer. So yeah, I've been spending a lot of time behind my computer, which is not really very different from what I usually do.
Yeah, I guess a lot of us are behind our computers all day these days. So you're also a translator. That's why you're on the show. You translated the book that we're doing for this episode, Death Notice. But the fact that you're also working in software engineering, computer science, makes you a wee bit different from other translators I've had on the show. So what is the story? How did you end up translating this novel? And is it the only novel you translated, or have you done other translation work even outside the world of novels?
Yeah, I was trying to think of the best way to kind of approach this, since what I'm doing right now is I guess not too closely related to translation. I'm wondering if the best way to kind of introduce myself might be just to go back a little bit to when I started learning Chinese, because what I'm doing now with coding, software engineering, that's more of I guess a recent like career transition. Initially from what would this be? From 2007 to 2011, that was when I was in college. That was when I first studied Chinese. And during that time, I did have 2 stints studying abroad in China, mostly in Beijing and several weeks in Chengdu. After I graduated from college, Hamilton College, in 2011, I actually moved to China, a city near Hangzhou in Shanghai, called Jiaxing. And
Yeah.
I was working there as an English teacher, but I mean the reason that I was doing it was to continue to really immerse myself in Chinese, and to my goal at the time, it was a very like vague and hazy goal. I just wanted to become a translator. So I did take the initial plunge into translation a few years later. I translated a short story for a translation contest. It was hosted by, I forget which exact branch, but it was affiliated with the Chinese government, so it was basically a very official translation contest. And the story that I translated was by an author named Hong Ke. The name of the story was Trainio, which I translated as Shooting the Bull. It's basically about 2 friends getting drunk and frolicking on the plains of northern China. I had a lot of fun translating that, and I was very surprised after submitting it. It was actually a long time after submitting it before I heard back, but I found out that it won was 3rd prize in the English category. So that was a very good boost to my confidence, and it inspired me to actively start seeking some kind of translation work. And I'm sure it also helped when I was trying to promote myself. So long story short, from I guess about that point, that was in 2014. From 2014 to about 2018, I was constantly doing some sort of translation. It varied from, I started doing art, translating a lot of art criticism. I also translated really a lot of various gigs, whatever came along. It could have been subtitles or brochures. I did several full-length like nonfiction books on Chinese art history. And
Wow.
But then kind of around the tail end of that, maybe starting in late 2015, 2016, that's when I started getting the Death Notice books. So I translated the first one, and I also translated the second one.
Right. And
then I did have the opportunity to take on the third, but that was around that same time. I had just moved back to the US. That was in like the end of 2018. And at that point, I realized that I didn't, at least in my opinion, I didn't really have a skill that lent itself to a full-time job, or at least the kinds of jobs that were available in the U.S. Because I'd been focusing a lot on Chinese just as a really like a part-time or like a freelance job, my translation work. But as far as full-time work went, I had been switching from, I was teaching English. I worked as a study abroad counselor. I worked as a technical writer for a bit, and then my last job before moving back, I was a video producer and editor at a startup. So a lot of like jumping back and forth, and that was when I made the decision to jump into software engineering. So that is really, I guess you could say, like my most recent venture. Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting ride over, I guess, the last like 10 plus years.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like you've had the kind of full gamut of experiences in, although it's 10 years, that's a lot of stuff crammed into 10 years. It's funny that you were just outside Hangzhou being an English teacher. That's well, so to speak, just outside, near-ish Hangzhou, because I had my first year in China was also like post graduation. Off I go with some vaguely defined goals, and I ended up in Zhejiang province, is Jiaxing in Zhejiang or is it in
Yeah,
Jiangsu?
yeah, yeah. Jiaxing is in Zhejiang province, and I also did live in Hangzhou for 2 years too.
Oh, nice.
Uh,
Yeah.
so that was I kind of ironically. I mean, now that I'm back here, I do end up reminiscing a lot about
Yeah.
my time in China, especially well now with the country basically locked down.
Yeah, it's getting easier and easier to kind of have like an alternate life in your, for me anyway, in like my memories and my
Yeah.
daydreams. It's fun to some extent, but I try not to indulge myself too much.
Mhm.
But yeah, Hangzhou was I was in Deqing County near Moganshan. Did you ever hear about or go to Moganshan?
Yeah, I actually did. Yeah, I did get to visit it once.
Yeah, I was near there. Hangzhou was like where I'd go most weekends. I can imagine living there for 2 years could be pretty nice.
Mhm. Yeah, it was nice. I was basically a 5 to 10 minute bike ride away from the West Lake.
Wow.
So I was yeah, definitely. I there were a couple of mornings, where I would just get on a mo bike and just ride around the lake.
Mm.
And yeah, yeah, like I said, I do wish that was what I could do now, but it's really nice to have had that experience.
Yeah, I've had a year intervening in Edinburgh, but if you kind of jump over that, my new life and my old life is hilarious. I used to be in Shanghai, one of the biggest cities in the world,
Mhm.
and now I'm in Fife, the Fife countryside of Scotland, in a little cabin just opposite a stable. So
Mhm.
it almost as big a contrast as you
Yeah.
could imagine. But I've already said it's best not to get too bogged down in our own reminiscences. So let's charge on and look at our book for this episode, Death Notice. So this is a Chinese crime novel by Zhou Haohui, and since it's a crime novel, I'm going to pursue 3 lines of investigation as I interrogate you. One's China, one is crime fiction, and one's Zhou Haohui.
Mhm.
So my first question about China was going to be, how did you learn Chinese? You've already talked about that. Is there anything else of interest to say about how it was for you learning the language, or shall we skip over that one?
Yeah, I could go into a little bit more detail in case any listeners are just curious or learning Chinese themselves.
Perfect.
I guess to kind of summarize my specifically my journey of learning Chinese. Well, like I said, for in college, I studied Chinese. That was my major. So my first exposure to Chinese was my first semester of college. And initially, I was I don't know if I should say that I was not very good at it, but I did have to have some extra tutoring around my first year. But what made it really click for me was after my second year in college, I did I guess it was a 5 to 6 month stint in Beijing. So that was basically over that was my summer and the fall semester. I was studying in Beijing. So my first time in China, living there for an extended period of time, and I was completely immersed in the language. We had to sign a language pledge where we promised to speak exclusively Chinese during the program, unless unless I was like calling family, because I guess otherwise I'd have to scribble notes on signs or something. But that experience, I think, really completely changed my own attitude towards learning Chinese. And I think what was really the turning point was just seeing firsthand or experiencing yeah. I mean, what really transformed my attitude towards learning Chinese was just being able to use the language every day and see it in use, whether it was reading, writing, speaking it.
Mm.
And I had the opportunity to make plenty of mistakes, have a lot of awkward misunderstandings. One that still stands out in my memory was we were assigned a quote unquote host family there. So we weren't living with them, but we did visit them a few times during each semester.
Yeah.
So when I visited mine, and so we were speaking in Chinese, and so there was one misunderstanding where we walked into a room in their house, and I think they might have had the air conditioning on because it was summer, and my host mother said, 这里凉快. So it's like, it's cool in here. But because this was a word that I actually, wasn't familiar with, I knew like, liang meant like cool or cold. But when she said 凉快, I thought she meant like 2块, like I have to pay, like 2 kuai, 2 renminbi. So, and I was thinking, what is it like, for the food that she got? And
Oh no.
I started reaching for my wallet, but fortunately I was visiting with another student who was a little bit more advanced in her Chinese, or at least understood that you didn't need to spend money here. So I started reaching for my wallet, but then I saw that the other student with me was just like, wasn't doing that at all. So before like either of them could see it, I just slowly put my wallet back. So living in China after like completing my major was super helpful for improving my Chinese, because it really is just making those mistakes. I think is what really helped improve my Chinese. And alongside that, when I was actually living in China after college, I spent a lot of time, probably too much time, just like in my apartment on campus, just reading books in Chinese. I really liked reading several books by Yuhua, who a lot of people might know as the author of To Live, which was adapted into a film directed by Zhang Yimou. The 2 books that I read by him were, I think the first one I read was Chronicles of a Blood Merchant, and I also read Brothers. I'm trying to remember the order that I read them in, but those were I enjoyed both of those a lot, and I took them very slowly, just consulting with a dictionary, or I guess by dictionary I mean Pleco, my phone, which is probably the most useful app I've ever downloaded. It's been installed in my phone since I guess basically since like I first visited China.
Right.
So I was consulting that as I was reading. So I think I also took notes on some words that I was unfamiliar with. I know a lot of people recommend that if you are reading or say like, watching a TV show or movie in another language, or at least I heard this from other people who are speaking Chinese, their recommendation was to not pause it, just to keep going and really try to just grasp like the gist of what was being said. But maybe it was just the way that I prefer to learn. I would watch movies and TV shows extremely slowly. I would pause every time there was a word that I didn't know and look it up, just because it would bother me if I didn't understand everything that was being said. I don't want to recommend my approach saying that, this is the way that you should learn, but I guess to present both, because I can definitely see the value in really, especially if you're watching a TV show or a movie, I think it might actually be better to just let it kind of wash over you, because that would prepare you for real life situations a little bit better. But I've had a lot of practice with just spoken and like conversational Chinese just through my wife, who is from northeastern China. Right. So yeah, even here in the US, we're speaking in Chinese every day. So it's still that's mainly how I get to continue practicing my Chinese, keep it from getting too rusty.
Are you speaking it with a Dongbei accent?
Not extremely. My wife has a her accent gets a lot stronger when she's speaking to family. So I've like visited her family for the Chinese New Year several times. So yeah, and that was definitely an interesting crash course in Dongbeihua, in northeastern Chinese.
Nice. It's nice that you mentioned Yu Hua. He's someone I've really should have done on this podcast already. I've been recommended and asked to do him a few times. But yeah, it's a good reminder. I've still not actually read nothing by him in translation, But speaking of reading things, let's move on to the next question. So crime fiction, outside of translation, as genre is absolutely huge. It's the best selling of any book genre in the UK, and I think for a lot of the rest of the English speaking world, it's second after romance, coming very close behind it. So it's massive. This is a huge genre. So it's really interesting to see books that are translated from Chinese, set in China, which are in this genre in like a really recognizable form. It's not, I think in this case, in this book, it's really not very different from other crime and detective books you'd get from writers writing in English. So I myself, I can't think of any crime fiction I've read in English, actually. Maybe some detective stories, but like any really classic examples of the genre that I've read are probably stuff I've read because it's translated from Chinese. Slightly strange to actually stop and think about that. But yeah, my question for you is twofold. One is, do you read much crime fiction yourself? And second part of that question is, do you have any thoughts about the crime fiction in China, what it means for a crime novel to be a Chinese crime novel?
Sure. So yeah, I guess kind of similar to you, I do not read a lot of crime fiction in general. Yeah, I was just trying to think of some of the books that I've read that could be considered crime fiction. I know that back in high school, I was a big fan of the Jack Reacher novels.
Right, they're like in the thriller sort of crossover bridge between those two genres.
Yeah. So definitely a lot of similarities. And I know when I was younger, I was a big fan of the Hardy Boys novels. So maybe a little more, more like detective novels. But I don't think I've read too much straight up crime fiction. I usually tend to although I guess I did read The Silence of the Lambs in high school, so I guess that counts. But I usually tend to gravitate towards like fantasy and sci-fi. And actually, so as for your second question about Chinese crime fiction, as far as like what I've read in Chinese, I also have just like in English, I prefer to read like fantasy and sci-fi, and it's the same. If I'm choosing something to read in Chinese, I'll usually pick like genre fiction. And actually, when I first moved to China, I went to one of the local bookstores, and I went to the sci-fi section, and at random picked a book, and it was a collection of short stories, and I liked it because I thought the cover looked cool, and I was like thumbing through the first story, and I thought it was good. So I brought it back, and it was actually by Liu Cixin, who
Sweet.
I knew nothing about him at the time. Let's see. I guess I think the first book in the Three Body series in China, I think came out in around like 2008. So that was already out by that time, but I wasn't familiar with it. But then, when he kind of blew up internationally, that was I think by that point I had already read the first Three Body book, but the Chinese version of that. And let's see, I was also not expecting when I initially picked up that collection of short stories that I would end up translating like another one of his short stories a few years later. One called With Her Eyes was published in a collection called The Wandering Earth, which is
I've read that.
One of his other short stories.
That's maybe that's where, when I was picking up my copy of Death Notice, I was like, Zach Haluza, I've seen that somewhere before, because The Wandering Earth is the translator credits are several different translators. So if you look in the copyrights page, the really famous name there is Ken Liu, but I guess in that line with him there's Zach Haluza. Right.
So cool. And I noticed that you've that you also had the chance to speak to Ken Liu on this podcast.
Yeah. This is it's the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast, but I think some listeners who found it via all the Chinese sci-fi episodes I've done have been surprised to realize that the word science isn't sitting before the word fiction in the podcast name, because I talk about it so much on the show. And if you place authors above translators, then the biggest stars from Chinese sci-fi I've had on would be shíchā and TrChFic. But yeah, Ken Liu did come on to talk about Hao Junfang's novel, and that was really surreal talking to him.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. It's and I guess a fun fact. So the company that basically the company that I got the Death Notice gig through. So a Beijing-based company called TrChFic. I think that's how you pronounce it. The acronym is CEPIEC. But they what they do is managing the foreign language translation rights of Chinese novels. The big, like the book that they'd handled before Death Notice was like books was the Three Body trilogy.
Right.
So they told me some stories about when they had the chance to meet Ken Liu. So that was definitely fun to hear about. One last note on like the topic of more like genre oriented fiction. I'm not sure if are you familiar with the kind of been translated into English as the Grave Robber Chronicles?
No, although I did have an episode with like a web fiction translator who goes by her username @Valair. She had translated a web novel which was in this Chinese genre of like grave robbing or tomb raiding. So I know a little bit about the genre as a whole, but I don't. If I have heard of this series, then I need my memory refreshed, I think.
Okay, yeah, I was just kind of curious because I don't think there's really been like a I want to. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this without possibly offending a fellow translator, but I don't know if there's been I guess you could say like a fully faithful translation made of the series
Right.
in English, but it's something that I read in Chinese and had a lot of fun with, and I've actually kind of been as an effort to really get back into reading Chinese. I am kind of like starting from the beginning again, but that's an example of I think a really I guess you could say like exciting kind of like thriller. It's really like a fast moving series of stories that it's basically like I guess you could picture it as Indiana Jones but set in modern day China. So that's an example of a genre fiction where the Chinese setting and character really plays like an important role in the story.
Right.
That was really interesting, like for me as a reader who obviously did not like grow up in this culture. I've noticed there's at least one, maybe two books in Amazon Crossings list of books translated from Chinese that are kind of dabbling in that genre. There's something I could say, it's probably going to come up at some point, but about like speaking about genre fiction as a whole. So listeners who've been listening since forever are probably tired of hearing about this by now. But last year I got invited to this conference, not a seminar, not a conference, a symposium. That's the word, a symposium on Chinese genre fiction in Leeds. And they were really just looking at two genres. One was sci-fi and the other was crime. And I remember I mentioned to you when we got talking, I'd met two of the people from Head of Zeus, who stupidly I thought were your publishers. I did my research since, and I've learned this book that I'm holding, the Head of Zeus edition, is a UK edition. The original, like the translation and the initial publication was done by Doubleday over in the States. But I think it's still worth mentioning Head of Zeus because outside of America, I believe they probably made an awful lot of money because they handled publication of the Three Body Problem in the UK and I think the Commonwealth. And since then, they've put out more Chinese sci-fi in English in the Commonwealth. But they were there at the symposium to kind of talk about how they were now trying to do the same for crime, Chinese crime fiction. So they're trying to make like a list of all these different books. And I'd imagine that's why they bought the Commonwealth, I think, rights for Death Notice. And I have read, when we're talking about like what Chinese crime we've read, I have read one of the other books that they've done or bought rights for, and it was Second Sister by Chen Ho-kei, but
that was kind of, different but the same compared with Death Notice, because he's a Hong Kong writer and that story set in Hong Kong, whereas this one's from the mainland, although it does have some sort of a link with Hong Kong that we might get into later in its TV adaptation. But yeah, I should probably keep the ball rolling here. Let's go into the third line of investigation. It's Zhou Haohui, the author himself. Can you tell the listeners much about Zhou and like what he does?
Sure. So kind of like a general summary of Zhou Haohui. I mean, he's a successful writer. He's really carved out a space for himself in the, I guess you could say, the suspense, thriller, crime genre in China. And I was actually doing a bit of research recently on him, and I had seen that. So he has branched out from prose to screenwriting. So he it looks like he co-wrote the screenplay for the Death Notice TV series, and also in 2018 he directed a film that he also wrote the script for. And just as, I guess, a bit of trivia, the title for that movie, it's a pun on the Chinese translation of Arabian Nights.
What's the pun?
The Chinese translation of Arabian Nights is 天方夜谭, and the Chinese title of this is 天方夜谭. So the last two characters are different, kind of like, I guess you could say, like strange conversations. Because it's I haven't seen it, but from what I understand about it, it's a movie where there are several different characters, each with their own story, kind of, and some of them are like border on the fantastical.
Cool.
I guess another thing about Zhou Haohui. So I haven't really had the chance to speak with him one-on-one, but I did get to interact with him when we were doing a couple of press interviews for Death Notice, which was basically just some. It was me, Zhou Haohui, and Chen Feng, who is the person who at TrChFic who I was in contact with like throughout the translation of the entire book, and he was really helpful in setting a lot of these things up. But we were on the phone, or I think we actually used WeChat just to have like a group voice call. And we were talking to there's one call with someone from the New York Times, another call with someone from the Wall Street Journal, and that was really, I guess, my first time doing like live interpreting. So I was basically Zhou Haohui's interpreter for each call, which was an interesting experience, maybe a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, I can imagine. I was probably going to mention this at some point. So my quote-unquote research for this episode consisted mostly of reading and rereading one New York Times article, which gave me some info about a more holistic picture of the book and its TV and film adaptations and Zhou himself. So I'll put a link for that in the show notes for listeners if you guys want to read it. Oh yeah, so I do have one more question. When you were working through your translation, did you have much correspondence with Zhou? Did you need to query him about anything, or did he want to correct anything?
So from what I remember, when I was doing the translation, there were a few points where I did have some questions about the translation, so I would make notes about it. But mostly, a lot of the questions I really asked Chen Feng, who I mentioned just a little bit earlier, and Zhou Haohui was fairly hands off throughout the process. From what I remember, he was I guess really wanted me to kind of I guess like take the reins at for the most part, and like translate it as I saw fit. And yeah, we can probably go into this a little bit later, but then after my initial translation was fairly faithful to the original, but there were some changes that were made a little bit later. Although I guess one thing that was changed during the initial translation, which might be might be a bit surprising for people who have read the novel is that the setting for the novel was initially not Chengdu. It was a fairly like anonymous city called I guess you could translate it as like City A, or in Chinese it was always like A Shi.
Right.
So when I started translating this, there was like one note that I got was that we should set it in an actual place, because in the original, Pei Tao, who was also called Luo Fei. Pei Tao is not his original name in the Chinese novel, but then the name was actually changed after I did my initial translation, and the reason for that was it was just because of legal issues. Because I think Zhou Haohui had prior to Death Notice written at least like one other book. I think the Chinese title for that, I know one of them was, I think, Xiong not sure what it is in English, but Luo Fei had been already like appeared as a character in an English translation of another one of his books. So there was some type of legal or copyright issue I was suddenly informed of as I started editing it. So I basically just did a select all and replace. So every Luo Fei became Pei Tao. Every Luo, all I had to check and just change it to Pei. But I was initially talking about the difference in setting. So initially in the original Chinese book, even though it was set in this city A, the main character was still from Longzhou, and one of the reasons why it was suggested that I choose an actual city is because, well, if the main character is from like an actual city, and I think there are several Longzhous in China, but I know the most famous one would be in Guangxi province.
Mm-hmm.
But so it was suggested that I use an actual city, and Chengdu was, as far as I remember, it was actually suggested to me. I changed the setting to Chengdu, and a lot of the I guess what you call the local flavor, a lot of that came out during the editing process and not during the initial translation.
Right. Yeah. I remember you had told me when we first got talking that there had been some interesting changes advised from the editorial level, and I was kind of wondering, I wonder what those are. That'll be interesting to find out. And then I read the New York Times article, and it said he's from Yangzhou in Jiangsu province. He's even written a book on Huaiyang cuisine, the cuisine of like Jiangsu and that region. And he was initially kind of conceiving of the city, I guess I've now learned, Asia, being like either Yangzhou or Nanjing or somewhere in Jiangsu, that sort of region. And then the New York Times article said, but yes, so then it was switched to Chengdu, and I was like, huh, what?
Mm-hmm.
But then I thought back on what I'd read, I thought, yeah, I can kind of see that, because the main reason I knew it was set in Chengdu was because like it said so. I remember there was a reference to a bowl of spicy dandan noodles, I think, and then otherwise it really could have been anywhere. It's not the Chengdu or Sichuan flavor isn't it's not oozing out the pages, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe to jump ahead a little bit, but it is I guess it's pretty relevant. When I was, like I said before, kind of adding this local flavor, it was really after after that initial manuscript had been picked up by Doubleday. The editing team, or well, it was mainly the head editor who was working with me, a guy named Robert Bloom. He had a lot of really helpful suggestions for editing and some points rewriting parts of the book. And one of his main points was to make the setting much closer to a character in many ways. So I, as I went through and was making edits and slight rewrites, I took the chance to really add more details about the setting, and try to think about it like what are some things that might stand out to a reader, or things that like I see, basically thinking about what I saw in my head in certain scenes, and thinking, well, what about this scene what would be helpful if I kind of explained or just added this detail to help an English speaking reader paint the same picture in their head. So the Chengdu in the novel became kind of an amalgamation of the really the different cities in China that I had lived in.
Right.
So I mean, I had mainly spent time in initially studying in Beijing, but then a lot of time in Zhejiang province. Although I had spent, like I said before, I was in Chengdu for 3 weeks as part of a study abroad program. So when I referenced I mentioned the dandan mian in the book. That is, well, yeah, my first experience with authentic Sichuanese food was with a bowl of dandan noodles in Chengdu, where it was really my first time having, because Chinese cuisine, you have like two, well, I guess you could say you have two main types of like spiciness to really generalize. You have, well, I guess the general type of spicy sensation that most people are familiar with, and then you also have like the numbing spiciness. And that was my first time experiencing that numbing spiciness. I started, eating the noodles a few bites in. My tongue, my mouth started to feel a little bit strange, and I got a little bit scared because I didn't know that this was supposed to happen.
It's like, oh no.
I was eating by myself, so I was thinking, am I allergic to this? Is there something wrong with my mouth right now? And I started, like, my eyes started watering, my nose started running, and then I realized, okay, I think I'm surviving this. I think it might be something with the food. I probably just really bit down on a big peppercorn.
Yep.
I did incorporate some elements of like my memory of Chengdu. I think after doing a lot of intensive research on Baidu, I did incorporate a bit of like Sichuanese. I think for the name of one area, which if my memory of several years ago serves me well, I think the translation, or it was the name of a place that was called something like the Roach Nest or something like that.
Right. Yep, that sounds right.
Yeah. So maybe I guess apologies to any listeners who are from Chengdu or who are living in Chengdu right now if my portrayal wasn't completely faithful, but I tried to the best of my ability represent a modern Chinese city. Cool.
What you mentioned earlier about the city being called like A City or City A is interesting that that's the case, because the other so I've done like 2 other crime novels on this podcast. One was The Perfect Crime by IE, which is really more like not really genre fiction, more of like a dark existential sort of thing that uses a crime as to drive the plot. But then the other one I did was much more like a crime, generic sounds mean, but like slots right into the genre crime novel, and that was The Untouched Crime. And I had the translator on for that one too, Michelle Dieter, and she was telling me there was a difference between the English and the original language versions. In the English language version, it's set in Hangzhou, funnily enough, and it's it's not too important that the setting is Hangzhou. We just know that most of the story is happening in the university area on the north side of Westlake. It's not too relevant, but at least it places the story on the map somewhere. But in the Chinese version, it's just called H City, and you kind of have to read between the lines to the references to the lake and stuff to know it's set in Hangzhou. And I think she said the reason for in that case is that China, where so many things are sensitive, if the story is about crime and official corruption and whatnot, it's better, or publishers prefer not to name any real places so that it doesn't seem they're pointing the finger at anyone. So I wonder if that's a convention in publishing crime fiction in China. I really don't know, but it would make sense to me.
Yeah, I actually wasn't really aware that this was kind of, a thing or like happened more than once. But yeah, I mean that reason does actually make sense, and probably yeah, I mean that is fairly likely that's the reason why it was originally the setting was originally a city or city A. Maybe this is just like my own imagination, but also the possibility that this could be any city.
Yeah, kind of reminds me. I think I said this in the Untouched Crime episode as well, but it kind of reminds me when you're reading like a novel from the Victorian times or thereabouts, and a place or a character will just be named as underscore. As I was talking, or they'll be initialed. I was talking to my good friend Jay, and it's like, oh, why are they doing this? But it was just a convention at the time that's since kind of receded. But yeah, that's the end of our chat about Zhou Haohui. That certainly went in some interesting tangents. But let's get on to talking about the book itself, Death Notice. So first things first, let's give the readers a sense of the story. I have my copy of the book in front of me, and it's got a blurb, and there's something pretty interesting about the blurb that a reader would notice once they're just a few chapters into the book. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read the blurb, and then maybe we can break it down. Or yeah, we'll break it down, I guess. So here we go. For nearly 2 decades, an unsolved murder case has haunted Sergeant Zheng Haoming of the Chengdu Police Department. 18 years ago, 2 victims were murdered after being served with death notices. In refined calligraphy, their perceived crimes were itemized and they were sentenced to death. The date of execution was declared, as was the name of their executioner, Eumenides. Now, a user on an internet forum has asked the public to submit names for judgment for those the law cannot touch. Those found guilty will be punished, and there is only one sentence: death. The user's handle? Eumenides. Does Zheng have a lead? Has a long dormant serial killer resurfaced? Perhaps modern police techniques, criminal profiling, online surveillance, and SWAT quick response teams can catch a killer who has previously evaded justice. Or perhaps the killer is more than a match for whatever the Chengdu Police Department can muster. The first in a trilogy and a bestseller in China, Death Notice is a high-octane, high-concept cat-and-mouse thriller that adds an exhilarating new gear to the police procedural. So pretty comprehensive blurb. The first thing I noticed, not meaning to spoil anything for anyone who's not read the book, Zheng Haoming is not our guy for most of the book. He gets bumped off pretty near the start.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we? Do you think the blurb misses anything really key that the listener should know about the plot, or do you think that summarizes everything nicely?
Yeah, it's. I think the main focus of the book, at least in my opinion, is really just trying to track this killer, this Eumenides, who's and his brand of, I guess you could call it, like crowdsourced justice. You could definitely focus on different characters, maybe a bit more on Pei Tao, but I think for drawing someone in, I think that sounds like a good angle to me, like focusing on this is a something with a bit of history behind it, and that they're trying to crack the case today.
Well, one thing that the blurb doesn't tell us, I didn't realize until fairly far through, is that it's not the Chinese edition is from a few years back. It says here in the copyright something like 2015 is when the Chinese book is from. 2014, and it made it into English 2018. But the setting of the book is like 2002 or 3 or 4ish. Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, I believe I would have to go back to Baidu for this, but I think that Death Notice was originally published earlier. I don't want to be spreading false information, but I think it was like initially published online.
Right. Yeah. I think so. I did a bonus episode on Patreon prior to this one, just kind of warming myself up in a way. And I think I checked this. It occurred to me that the online publication wouldn't be the same as the print one. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I remember right, the online publication was just a year or 2 before the print. I don't think there was a huge gap. So my thinking was that he'd maybe put the setting that far back in time to avoid the problem of like smartphones and wireless internet and stuff.
I'm actually not too sure about why the setting was moved back, but I mean, just in in general, and I mean, as someone who occasionally enjoys writing, I think something that is nice about choosing a certain period in time as opposed to always making it the present is that you are kind of like fully aware of the constraints of the time, and I guess there's less chance of it seeming outdated if you choose something that is deliberately set in the past. But yeah, just to go slightly off on a tangent, but what you were mentioning about the when the print edition was published, I actually back in 2015, that was when I was initially contacted about translating this.
Right.
But so I initially received a I guess it was like a Word doc version of the novel, but then I was told to hold off on it for I guess it was like about half a year or so, because they were making edits, like edits to the Chinese version. So I guess this was as the print version was getting ready to go out, and then once that was ready, that was when I could go ahead with my translation.
Wow, so they really on the ball with getting this one out into multiple languages as fast as they could. That's interesting. Yeah, so that's our story. Oh yeah, no, there was one other question that was on my mind. So the name of the killer, Eumenides, the book goes out of its way to stress that the online messages, the name, the username Eumenides has been spelled out in the Latin alphabet, so it's not like a Chinese transliteration or anything. Is this an adaptation for the English version, or is this exactly the same in the Chinese too?
It's really the only like non-Chinese word that appears in the book. And actually, you did remind me that as I was translating the book, I was pronouncing the name Eumenides incorrectly in my head the entire time. I always assumed it was Eumenides.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the fun things about reading books. I've just been reading some short stories by Ted Chiang, and there's a story where it's about like online kind of AI pet sort of things, and they're called Digients. But my brain was obviously getting flashbacks to when I watched Digimon as a kid. I was calling them Digidents in my head. Thankfully, no one was there to hear me mispronounce it. But then about halfway through, I was like, oh no, I'm I've been calling them Digimon. They're actually Digients. And in an earlier episode of the show, this came up, and I had told the story of how my dad used to read Harry Potter to me, and Hermione in my world was Herimony for years and years, until my granny caught me saying it and laughed at me.
I think in my head it was I forget if it was like Hermione or Hermione, like until I actually saw the first movie.
I'm sure lots of adults who'd been reading the book had a bit of like an oh shit moment when they were sitting in the cinema watching that one.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So my next question here, I think we've both established we're not masterful readers of, or not highly veteran. We're not veteran readers of crime, but I have a feeling that there's kind of a spectrum in crime fiction, and it's kind of like one end of the spectrum you have fun, light reads, and then at the other end you've got relentlessly dark stuff. So like the TV series True Detective, that's on the relentlessly dark. It gets so dark that we go into like philosophical pessimism. And maybe like the lighter end of the spectrum would be someone investigating a stolen teacup or something. But there's also like the page turner, or not necessarily how much of a page turner something is, but also how literary something is. And I suppose you could have a light crime novel which is quite literary and trying to be deep, but I feel like the literariness tends towards, or the philosophical heaviness would probably tend towards the darker stuff. And my feeling about this book was it's struck a fairly good balance. It didn't feel like fluff, but it wasn't mentally taxing me, and it kept me turning the pages, and it seemed like it was very competently written. The thing that was making me think was it's a pretty dark topic, and the murders that happen are quite gruesome, but I felt like it could have potentially been written several shades darker, but this is really subjective. So I guess my question is, like, how dark on the spectrum of like a light read to a dark and heavy read, where do you think this book sits?
Well, Yeah, I guess, I mean, first, I definitely agree with what you're saying about the balance that it strikes. Um, and my feeling, just, what I was thinking as I was translating the book and looking back on the edits, is that there's definitely an emphasis on this constant momentum of the plot.
Mm.
And I think just by that nature, yeah, making it lean more towards being a page turner, you possibly like linger a little bit less on the darker elements of the book and the plot, which, could prevent it from feeling a little bit too much like you're, drudging through all this gloominess of the book. But actually, I think that maybe not the book as a whole, but certain parts of the book are a little bit darker than the original. Mainly, one thing that stands out to me is when you have that one scene in like in the mine tunnels, where the characters find these like the bodies hanging from the like the tunnel ceiling.
Yeah.
That was not in the original. And
Oh.
the way that came about was it was initially suggested by like Robert, the head editor at Doubleday, who his specific feedback was that because like previously the police had seen a like a recording of what was it? I guess 12 people being killed in a setting that looked fairly similar to the mine tunnels. So his suggestion was, what if like you actually find the bodies? What if the police find the bodies once they're actually in the tunnels?
Right.
So I took that, and I think his initial suggestion was like a pile of the bodies. But then I thought, okay, well, what would be a way to make it a little bit more a little bit darker, so I just
Or more
picture them,
striking
yeah,
cinematic image way too.
a little bit more morbid, and I just thought of, well, they could be hanging from the ceiling.
That's a pretty good creative choice. It, like if it was a pile of bodies, I'd be like, oh, okay, right, they're dead. Whereas hanging from the roof, that I'd be, as a reader, I was more like, oh no, this guy
Like,
really is
yeah,
evil.
like it's a little bit more like presentational, where it's like meant to
Mhm.
be discovered by someone.
Right, yeah, it's more a deliberate choice by the baddie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting that you the editor and you as the translator made so many changes. Was there any pushback against any of that from the Chinese side, or is that all top secret?
No, I mean, they were like, they were fine with the translation. It was and the kind of like free reign that I mentioned earlier, that really mainly came into play once we were doing the edits of the book.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, as far as I remember, the Chinese like client, or like Sepiek, Zhou, Haohui, they were all like very open to all the changes, basically just to make it as good as it could be, or as like exciting as it could be
Yeah.
for an English speaking audience.
That's interesting. I have had similar but not the same stories where editorial decisions on the English language side have like informed either the Chinese author has felt like they've gotten some good feedback, or it's even something that's incorporated into later Chinese editions. So I don't know. I don't know if this would bore the listeners because it's been mentioned before. But I'll give two really quick examples from Chinese sci-fi. Chen Qiufan's Waste Tide, he got quite a lot of feedback from the editor at Tor about some of the descriptions of the female characters and how they were treated, and so those were implemented in the English edition. I don't know if they've been implemented back on the Chinese side, but Chen Qiufan himself said he kind of felt grateful for the feedback. It was something he hadn't considered before, and he'll try and incorporate it back into his own writing. But like another example, I think I could be wrong here. I'm pretty sure this is right. But do you know about the chapter order change that happened in the Three Body series?
No, actually, I haven't heard about that.
Yeah. So, well, if you pick up the English edition of Three Body Problem, the first chapter we start off in the Cultural Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
And in the original Chinese edition, that's a flashback that happens about halfway through the book. And when Ken Liu, I think himself, suggested putting it to the front, he thought it was a better opener. And when he ran that idea by Liu Cixin, the author, Liu Cixin said, "Oh, how did you know that was initially how the book was supposed to be? I only moved it into the middle so that the censors wouldn't immediately be triggered when I was trying to get the book published." So I don't know if that change has been kind of reverted back into the Chinese edition. Perhaps not, but I do know other changes that were made in the English translation were now implemented into later editions of the Chinese. So yeah, I guess those are instances where the editors over in the English side had a fair bit of free reign, but it's in some ways they weren't making creative choices, whereas you got the opportunity to kind of add some of your own imagery, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that was and actually, like what you mentioned about the portrayal of like female characters, that was I guess in particular the character Mu Jianyun.
Yeah.
The yeah, part of a big part of the edits was kind of like how she was portrayed. Maybe not so much her like her as a a character and her actions, but just the relevant descriptions.
Yeah.
There was a bit more of an emphasis on her, I guess you could say, like her like feminine characteristics, which is something that's like a little bit more common in Chinese writing, and I mean, I guess to be honest, like a lot of Western writing until maybe more recently. So and with that, there were edits made to make her present her more as a member of the task force rather than like a female member of the task force.
Yeah, it makes me think of the like lists BuzzFeed makes of like hilarious examples of men writing women, and they often kind of go for those kind of weird or superfluous descriptions of their bodies. So I can understand as an editor not wanting to end up on one of those lists and being the object of fun for all the readership of BuzzFeed. Going back again to like potential darkness. So the book, as the blurb kind of hinted at, deals with like kind of like vigilante justice and bad people in society that the law isn't touching, getting what they deserve. And some of the people are just like murderers who've gotten away with their crimes, or there wasn't sufficient proof that they should be punished or whatever. But there are other people who are kind of like at the top of the society, wealthy people who've done dodgy dealings. I don't think any people from the government get knocked off, but there are people who have like done business with government officials and whatnot. So what did you think of the handling of societal corruption, and were there any changes made there in the English edition?
Well, I guess as far as changes and like changes to humanity's like targets, there weren't really any changes made there, and I think that it's definitely like, well, yeah, definitely like a bold move to be, targeting people like within the police, and who are like fairly high up in society. But I think in doing so, it does like, I'm assuming like struck a chord with a lot of the readers, and it would do the same thing in with really wherever you are. If you're reading it, you probably are in a place where a very very similar like situation is taking place, where there is like corruption throughout society at all different levels. Kind of the maybe it's going slightly off topic, but the kind of like treatment of humanities and like his mission reminded me a little bit of in the movie Black Panther, with the villain Killmonger, who I'm not sure if you've seen it.
I've seen it, yeah. Watched that in Shanghai, in one of the cinemas inside the shopping mall.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I feel, and I think like a lot of the like a lot of members of the audience who saw Black Panther felt that, like, I mean, Killmonger is like almost you could say like the justifiable hero of the movie, except he does like, he was written to like cross the line a little bit too much into I guess what you could say like is like being evil into murder, but still making like valid points. And I feel like something similar might be going on with Eumenides, where he is making very valid points about the corruption in society, how many people are given a pass because of their wealth or their influence, which I guess in many cases are the same thing. But because of some of the actions that he's taken, starting with I guess when he was faking his own death, it also involved like a double like homicide, where you can't fully sympathize with him.
Yeah, definitely like an ends justify the means sort of a guy. I was trying to think of an example like that where you have someone who is making absolutely correct criticisms of people or society, but then that takes it to murderous extremes. I couldn't think of any really good one-for-one examples, but the one that kept popping into my head was Jigsaw from Saw, the Saw films. Maybe just because he's got a cool name like Eumenides, where it's like he's have you seen any of the Saw films?
Yeah, I've seen the first two, but I can definitely see a similarity.
Yeah, the reason I was thinking of Jigsaw from Saw is he makes completely valid points about people's lives. He even gives them some good feedback on the way they could improve their lives, but he also uses an excuse to do absolutely horrific things to people's bodies and faces. Right. A little bit like our guy Eumenides is doing in this story. Yeah. Although the way I'm saying that makes it sound like we get his point of view. We absolutely don't. He's like a shadowy, behind the scenes sort of figure all the way through. Which character in this story jumped out at you the most?
Well, initially, I guess initially it would be Pei Tao, or who was originally Luo Fei. Just because he's the protagonist of the novel, and as like a translator, I was like spending the most time with him. But I think as I went through like the edits and was making like slight tweaks to some of the characters and making sure I was portraying them in the best, like I guess you could say, most like three-dimensional way. It was probably a toss-up between like Mu Jianyun and Zheng Rihua. Mu because well, kind of for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, being the only like female member of the task force. I had to take a bit more like a bit of care like when editing my like descriptions of her, was which were originally I was trying to be like very faithful to the original novel. And I know that like when she's first introduced in the Chinese novel, she's described as like a true Southern beauty. Right. So these were things that had to be changed a little bit in in the English version, and also just being conscious, making sure that she is being presented as like being on the at the very least like equal footing with the rest of the task force. And then as for Zheng, he was like in many ways the comic relief character, and as far as like my recollection of the edits, I think I made him much more like sarcastic in this version. I mean, he was definitely a bit sarcastic in the original, but well, I think what I was doing was just kind of injecting my own sense of humor into him. And since a lot of his lines were like humorous, there was definitely a lot of like tweaking that went on to get the right effect in translation.
Right. Yeah. So we should probably mention those two characters kind of end up as a duo. They have quite a lot of scenes together, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And those are some of my favorite bits, because those were very much about the characters quite a lot. They were each a kind of a cool thing about the team in the book is it's different points. They're all trying to work their own angle, either for their own reasons or because they think it's the best way to solve the crime. And yeah, the way that those two So we should probably mention Zhou is ineptly trying to hit on Mu the whole time, and she's having none of it, basically. Or when she's not having none of it, she's humoring him because she can't be bothered, or because she's trying to get something out of him, which could potentially be really icky. But it's all handled pretty tastefully, and I think I've now learned probably a lot of credit there goes to you, because well, obviously Zhong's not supposed to be completely likable, but he came off as funny rather than icky, and Mu came off as a pretty well-rounded character. I think it seemed to be striking a good balance between. I think she's written to be like an attractive, smart woman, but she's not reduced to that at all in the English version, which was nice. Because I kept worrying, oh no, is this going to cross the line, and am I going to be fed up with the author? But it never happened. So yeah, I think good job there.
Yeah, thanks. And it's definitely due to a lot of that worrying occurring, like both on my behalf and like the head editor's behalf. So definitely took a lot of care there.
So our next set of questions are the kind of publishing and translation related questions. I guess we've already gone into this a lot, so I'm just gonna go through these, and if we looks like we might be repeating ourselves, well, let's not bother repeating ourselves. But here we go. So I've mentioned already that I've got the Head of Zeus edition of the book, the UK and possibly Commonwealth wide version, and I'm assuming they bought those rights from Doubleday. Perhaps they got them directly from the Chinese, the acronym, the CEP, CEPIAC, yeah, possibly from them. I don't know. But what I want to ask is, so I mentioned earlier that Head of Zeus, they are going out of their way to try and publish more like kind of crime books from China. They're trying to make like a China crime list to go alongside their Chinese sci-fi list. So do you think publishers like them, and maybe also Amazon Crossing, who've got a few similar books, do you think they're going to find a lot of sales, I guess? Do you think they're going to strike gold doing this? Or do you think the market for crime and detective stuff from China is a little bit limited?
Well, I mean, just in because I guess like I've mentioned before, I'm not like super well versed with the landscape of Chinese crime fiction, but I believe I believe, and I'm sure that the publishers are aware of this too, but that the I believe that the success of the Three Body series, really helped put like popular Chinese fiction on the map as far as international audiences are concerned. So I mean, yeah, I'm sure that it's like a thought in the back of these publishers' minds that they're trying to find kind of their like Three Body series, but like in the crime genre. And I mean, in general, I mean, I know that there is a lot of good like Chinese fiction out there, a lot of great like Chinese genre fiction out there. So it's really just a matter of like finding like that book or like that series that kind of like catches the like international imagination in the same way. And I mean, I'm guessing that the like the translation of this book of Death Notice was like, you know, since it was the same company handling the copyright, like the foreign translation copyrights, was also, you know, spurred by the success of like the Three Body series and the interest in that.
Yeah, I think you could be right. A thing it's certainly not a secret, but it's you have to look a little bit to find this. The kind of the people who got the ball rolling on getting Three Body into English, it was CPAC. It was them that got the ball rolling. So yeah, there's like a mutual interest on both sides in making these things blow up for, you know, just for obvious reasons. There's so much in a world where it's going to get harder and harder to ignore China. It's pretty important that some of these things happen. What you're saying about trying to find the next Three Body series, that really makes sense, thinking about the books that Head of Zeus do, because the other Chinese crime book I read from them, the Hong Kong one, Second Sister, that's the first in a series too. And this, well, not intending any spoilers here, I guess we've already mentioned this, but right at the end of Death Notice, there's a huge setup for book two. It's really, it's makes absolutely no it lets you make no mistake that there is supposed to be a sequel for this book. And I've seen online that I think you can already pre-order book 2, Fate. I think it's certainly like the cover art and pages on publishers' websites. They're all up there now.
Yeah, and I think I was actually just checking because the last time I saw it was set to be published later this year, but it looks like it's been pushed back to February.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it does also make sense if you are going to be investing in the translation of a book and trying to build up a big audience for it. I guess it does make sense that you would be looking at like a series, some kind of franchise, something where you could continue to gather attention as as each edition or as each installment in the series comes out. And I was just thinking of, well, I mean, in crime fiction, I haven't read it, but I mean the what's it called, the Millennium series by Stieg Larsson.
Yeah, the girl who kicked the hornet's nest.
Yeah, and I mean, there's massive interest in in the U.S. or just among English-speaking audiences for that, and the fact that it's a series that you can latch onto makes it a bit more, I guess, a bit more accessible, where you don't have to keep looking for different examples of Nordic crime fiction if you don't want to. So it's probably a similar approach, I'm guessing.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a kind of a parallel with Three Body in that it was on one hand enjoyed just for what it was, a great story in a particular genre, but also looked at as kind of representative of the country it's from. So I think there's probably a lot to looking at it in that way. A next technical question. Can you recall any kind of interesting linguistic problems that you hit upon while working on this book?
I think one that really stands out in my memory is not the translation of a certain term so much as just a difference in writing style. And I remember that in the original there is a fairly frequent use of adverbs, especially in relations or in relation to to speaking, to, I mean, these are just examples off the top of my head, or to say he said slyly, or something like that. And I am a big fan.
Anti-adverb.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of Stephen King's On Writing book, in which he stresses that point.
I was just about to Google the bit from that because it's really funny. I know exactly the part you mean.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember how many times I've read it, but it's deeply ingrained in my head. So I know in my first version, I definitely did keep some of the adverbs in there, but tried to make them a little bit less glaring. And part of this is, I mean, not saying that the original wasn't written properly or wasn't written well. Part of it is just the difference between, the linguistic difference, and how adverbs are seen in English and in English writing.
Mm-hmm. And as well as differences between cultures, if you look back at different kinds of writing from different eras, different styles kind of go in and out, and not to say that one's better or the other, but people's tastes change. So who knows, maybe 200 years in the future, people are going to look back on writers from our era or our generation and think, oh gosh, what a strange period in English writing where everyone insisted on having very plain adverb-free prose. You know what I mean? It's just what works for one set of readers and reads as good and not flowery or silly won't work for the others. So I see absolutely no kind of contradiction in doing a faithful translation and getting rid of those adverbs, because if it's supposed to read as fairly serious and clean, then you wouldn't want loads of slyly, sneakily, cleverly. It looks a bit kind of primary school in English, I think, just by the standards and tastes of today.
Yeah, and also one thing that the editing team stressed for this was just really to make this a bit more of a, I guess you could say a terser read, just cutting out certain small sentences or paragraphs, like small paragraphs that didn't really advance the plot or advance the pace, just to make sure it was like a very fast moving story, which is something that I think a lot of the English speaking readers were expecting. So again, like a genre expectation.
Yeah, this is something that's popped up a few times on the podcast and reading about translations of Chinese works and whatnot. It seems like books in China are, one, often quite a lot bigger in terms of word count than English language books, and two, aren't line edited, so like edited in terms of prose nearly as heavily. I think the consensus I've kind of gathered is that the editor, like the power, if we were like doing superheroes or top trump cards or something, the power of the author is quite a lot higher in proportion to the editor in China, whereas in the English language publishing or market or whatever, editors have got more authority and power over their authors. So if you really want, it seems like often if you really want to do a good job bringing a book both into the English language but also the English language market, the translator has to take on a little bit of the editor role, because there's like a gap between English language market editing and Chinese language market editing. There's some kind of leftover slack that could be tightened, so to speak.
Yeah. It's definitely something that was like a big concern during the editing process, just to make it like as tight a read as possible.
Yeah, well, it is a very tight read, so I guess mission accomplished. Yeah, I think that's all my kind of main questions done with. So now we're going to go into the miscellaneous odds and ends section. So first thing I'm going to ask is, could you suggest like a word of the day for us, a Chinese word of the day relevant to the story?
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. I think one that is pretty relevant to the plot of the book, and also just like fairly useful in general, is the word shíchā, which literally means like time difference, and commonly used to refer to like the difference between time zones in different countries. I used it and like heard it a lot, to refer to like the jet lag that I felt after traveling like back and forth, between the U.S. and China. But as you and listeners who have read the book might be able to guess, the shíchā really comes into play with that really important 2-minute time difference. So yeah, and that's why I suggested that word.
So shíchā being time, cha being difference.
Right.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, this is actually something I forgot to mention, is the level of detail and like kind of logical planning out of events that Zhou Haohui must have done, where he's figured out down to the minute how an event would have happened, and then how people interpreting that event would have, one, figured out details, or found this 2-minute time difference, and then analyzed it and used it to get a better picture of what happened and whatnot. All the kind of logic of things is really impressive. That's the really big feat, I think, of the book, is these kind of logical puzzles that he would have worked out, I guess, in the planning stage, and then built a plot and dramatic events around. But yeah, something I really forgot to mention that I talked about in that bonus episode I pre-recorded was about the reception of the book on Douban. So like I actually mentioned this in the last interview I did. Douban, you probably know this. I'm more talking to the listeners. It's kind of like Chinese IMDb, but it also is like Chinese Goodreads. It has a book section, movie section. I think there's a music section too. But it's a really good place to find out what Chinese readers thought of a book. So I said in that last interview as well, my Chinese reading level is not even good enough to read a comment or a review on Douban. So I'm usually, unless there's something that the auto translation didn't catch, I'll be reading the whole thing using Google Auto Translation. But even then, it gives me a really interesting view of what Chinese readers are kind of thinking of a book. And I noticed that a lot of the comments, whether they were positive or negative about this book, were about the kind of logical skill that Zhou Haohui has. So some were saying, wow, he's really scientific and logical in the way he works out the plot and the events. And that makes it a high quality work, which is good, because I think they were saying that it seems like they kind of quote unquote quality level of some Chinese crime is in question, the reviewers seem to be saying that some of the works they've enjoyed aren't as logical, and they wanted crime books from China to be more logical. And for some of them, they were seeing Zhou Haohui as like a genius in like the kind of just logistics of how the investigations and the crimes work. And there were some other people who weren't so happy with the logistics of how everything happened. But I just thought it was interesting that that's where the focus was. I could see that being very similar in other like crime fiction in general. But again, I'm a bit of an ignoramus. I don't know. But yeah, did you have to worry about any of that as a translator? Just a precise description of events and chronology and characters, knowledge and point of view and stuff like that?
Well, with that, I was definitely fortunate to have an editor to like keep me honest and
Right.
to really call out, because yeah, I mean, as a as like a writer, or well, more accurately in this case, the translator, with my nose like really deep in the actual like writing itself, it's sometimes it's easy to lose sight of certain things if like a certain detail causes a conflict with the actual the way that the events are laid out, or if something is even like removed or slightly changed during the editing process that like later conflicts with something. Yeah, the editor, like Robert, did a really good job of pointing out any contradictions that arose, and even in some cases I think suggesting ways that it could be tightened, or I believe like made a little bit clearer in some cases. Yeah, and what you mentioned about like the Chinese reception of the book, that like was definitely, I mean, it's definitely really interesting to hear. Also, I mean, what I was thinking as you were describing those reactions, I was thinking about why people might approach this genre, why people might be drawn to crime fiction. I guess why Chinese readers might be drawn to it versus why like English speaking readers might go for crime fiction, because in some cases they might have slightly different like foundation. A lot of, let's say, like American crime readers might get into it because, I don't know, if they listen to like a lot of true crime podcasts or certain like movies that they'd watched. Whereas, and this is all like speculation, but I don't know, some Chinese readers might get into the genre for different reasons. It could be the logical aspect of it, which is definitely a part of I think crime fiction in general. I mean, you have like Sherlock Holmes, and which is full of logic. But yeah, I'm sure everyone has their different reasons.
Yeah, for sure. It's a line I walk on the podcast is occasionally trying to indulge in some kind of like a speculation or generalization about Chinese readers this or blah blah this, blah blah that, but then also not wanting to be making things up or generalizing too much. But yeah, it's tricky because it is so fun to speculate about stuff like that. I guess as well, the Chinese internet being what it is, if there was a commenter who wanted to write something like, this doesn't nearly get into the absolute depths of corruption in Chinese cities, humanities should be going after the head of the province, or that, that's an invisible review. We'll never read that one on Douban. So whereas stuff about the logic is a bit safer. So there's my stupid generalization there, my taking a shot at the Chinese internet censorship. But yeah, we're getting a bit too serious. Let's become silly again. If Death Notice was a drink, what kind of drink would it be? And I should say here, soft, hard, and hot drinks are accepted. It doesn't always have to be booze, but if it is, that's good.
Let's see. I would say if Death Notice was a drink, at least for me, it would be black coffee, because that is what fueled, I'd say, about like 95% of my translation.
Right.
And just the fact that it is a thriller, it is a page turner, it's always keeping you on your toes. So it is, I guess, kind of like a version of literary caffeine.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair description. I certainly got through it very quickly as well, possibly sped up by caffeine. Yeah, so that's all my fun, silly questions done. Here's your self-promo slot. So if listeners want to find out more about yourself or things you've done, is there anywhere we can direct them?
Yeah, well, I guess I mean you could find me on LinkedIn for sure. Though that's a little more like professionally oriented, but let's see, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. Recently I haven't been tweeting a lot, although I'm constantly checking it and liking different tweets. And I do have my own website, which is just like my last name, Haluza .dev. And that's mostly just to kind of put myself out there as a software engineer. But yeah, I mean, I would say if anyone is interested in like chatting with me or asking questions about translation, software engineering, or God forbid politics, feel free to just get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn.
There you go. Cool. Yeah, I was thinking when you were describing going from translation to coding, and you were saying the two things aren't really connected, and I was trying to think, is there some smarty pants way I can say how getting like language commands into code language is like getting stuff from Chinese into English? And I thought, no, there's just too much scope to embarrass myself here. I won't do it. But yeah, right. So the next question I had written down here was a complete typo. It was me planning to ask you about where listeners can read wuxia online. Obviously, that's not a question intended for you.
I would be interested in learning.
Yeah. Wuxiaworld.com. That's where you want to go for that. But yeah, I guess we could direct the listeners to where they can get their hands on Death Notice and maybe pre-order the sequel. And I guess the answer is like Amazon or your favorite bookshop or your favorite online book vendor. It's pretty widely available, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's where, at least that's where I would go here in the U.S. to maybe my local Barnes and Noble, or any big bookstore, or just off Amazon.
But yeah, last question for you. What are you reading just now?
Well, I guess if you ask me like over the past year, it would mostly be like technical documentation, just for kind of making that transition into software engineering. But I have been so I felt embarrassed for a while because I was a really avid reader through high school and through a big part of college, and even when I was in China, reading both like English and Chinese books. But recently, I've been reading so much. But one book that I have been like picking up, and I guess I'm like mostly through, is a book called Exit West. And I don't want to mispronounce the author's name, but I believe you'd say it, Mohsin Hamid.
Right.
And it touches on topics like immigration and refugees with a slightly more fantastical approach. It's about these doors that start appearing in certain places, like a door that leads to like a different city or a different country. And about the immigration that kind of results from this, or unrest in certain locations. And I think it's definitely a timely read. And especially probably like pre-COVID might be a little bit more timely because it's all about people moving around. But it's definitely one that I would recommend to, if it sounds interesting to you, I would definitely recommend reading it. Maybe a bonus, kind of something that I'm reading, and a recommendation. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm getting back into reading like Chinese, just through starting from the beginning of the Grave Robber Chronicles. And I would recommend that to anyone who is looking for like a Chinese language read, maybe, whether it's just something enjoyable to read, or if they're, still learning and are looking for a challenge. Because those, like I mentioned, they are kind of like fast-paced reads, but they also do deal with a lot of, I guess you could say, like historical or like archaeological terms, that if you're interested in the genre, I think would be interesting. Kind of in the same way that reading the Chinese like language version of the Three Body series is a good introduction to a lot of scientific terms.
Right. I just popped the Grave Robbers Chronicles into Google, and it seems like on Amazon.co.uk there's a translation available. All 6 books seem to be in English. So anyone who wants to read the English ones, I think the publishing world has you covered. But for anyone who wants to take your suggestion and read the Chinese original, what's the Chinese name of the Grave Robbers Chronicles?
The Chinese name would be 盗墓笔记.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, if anyone's interested.
Excellent. Well, that's me all out of questions for you, Zach. Is there anything else you want to say before I say thank you and bid you farewell?
No, I think that's just about it for me. So yeah, I've definitely enjoyed having the chance to talk to you, Angus, about Death Notice, about my translation experience, and just translation and literature in general. Definitely glad that you found me on Twitter.
Yes, I'm glad I was able to find you. Twitter's been the best place for finding show guests, I guess, because everyone's on it, and it's not like Facebook. It's not weird if I follow people on Twitter like it would be if I just added them out of the blue on Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, right now, Twitter is really it's really the only, like, I guess you could say, like, general social media that I use. There is LinkedIn, although that's mostly for finding jobs. But kind of like, yeah, for me, Twitter works as kind of like all-purpose social media.
Ending on those ruminations on Twitter, I'm gonna say thanks and stop the recording. All right, that's your show. Now it's time for the plugs. Now I'm going to do these nice and efficiently, I'm hoping as well, although we'll see. I do have a tendency to wander down oral alleyways. That sounded horrible, didn't it? Oral alleyways. Anyway, so social media first. Let's do that. So places you can give me feedback on episodes, things you liked, didn't like so much, any key facts you think me or my guest missed for any episode. Social media is a great way to get in touch, to relay those various things. So the show's Twitter is just my Twitter, and that's at Angus Likes Words. The show has an official Instagram account. It is at TrChFic, TrChFic. There's also a Discord where you can talk with other people on the show. It's been a bit quiet lately, so I'd love to see more back and forth on there. But I can't wave a wand to make that happen. That's down to you guys, of course. I'm thinking of making a subreddit, although I think that, I don't know if we've really got enough people and enough activity to justify that, but it's something at the back of my mind now, so let me know if that would interest you. But yeah, that's that. Okay, to make me rich. JK, to help support the show and help me cover hosting fees and things like that, you can go to two places. There's Patreon, where from as little as $1 per month, you can access the bonus shows. I've got lots of these queued up for the coming month. We've got something like 35 episodes now. I've done kind of like warm-up episodes for a lot of the shows I've covered. So I had like a warm-up one for this one, a warm-up one for an upcoming episode on Last Quarter of the Moon, and I have a really cool, creepy, crazy one lined up for Halloween. So, spooky people, there's something there for you. If you are horrified by the idea of money coming out of your bank account every month, and who wouldn't be, there's a place where you can give like a one-off contribution, and that is buymeacoffee.com, and it does what it says on the tin, really. So both of those ones, you just enter the website's name and stick /TrChFic on the end, TrChFic. So patreon.com/TrChFic, buymeacoffee.com/TrChFic. Links for those are on the show's main homepage on Podbean, so they're all there. Another thing I should have probably announced at the start of the show, actually, is transcripts for the show. We have 4 of them now. 3 I made myself. One Yilin Wang got a pro to do, and that's on her website. I have links to them all on a WordPress I made for the show. That's linked to from the show's homepage. But yeah, we now have transcripts for episode 1, episode 2, episode 21, which is the one about Han Song and the creator and the passengers, or the passengers and the creator, sorry. And the Yilin Wang one, that's the one about the woman in the carriage. I forget the exact number, but it's one of the wuxia episodes. So if you like to consume podcasts as text, well, we have 4 of those now that you can read rather than listen to. Now, the most important thing is how you can spread the word about the show. So if you know someone who might be interested, be it a friend, a colleague, a boss, or indeed your fellow team on the homicide crew who you've been trying to hit on awkwardly, you could recommend the show to them. But please don't do it as a way to try and hit on them or chat them up. That would, number one, be a bad move. And number two, it would something that we would have to run by our editor and our translator just to make sure it's appropriate for the market. We got to take that into consideration. So yeah, until next episode and until we catch the killer, 再见.